Welcome, bike travelers and bike packers, to another episode of Chainwheel Diaries, stories about bike travel told by the travelers themselves. I'm your host, Brian Berlin. Recently, I discovered a book, Sharing the Road, an Amateur Cyclist's 10,000-mile solo bike trip across America, written by John Nitti. I was so impressed with the story that I invited John to the podcast, and he graciously agreed to do so.
My guest today is John Nitti, author of the book Sharing the Road, an Amateur Cyclist 10,000-mile solo bike trip across America. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Great to be here.
Tell us what you're up to these days.
So I'm in fintech software sales. Work mostly remotely in New York City. So our office is in Midtown, but I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn now, on the other side of the river. And work mostly remotely, but still go in every once in a while too.
Well, I got to say, your book is a great story, but it's also well written, and I recommend it often to everyone, even if the reader's not planning to ride across the country and back. It's that well written of a book. It's that compelling to read.
Thank you. I appreciate that. First time writing a book, so you kind of get better at it like anything as you go. And I wrote it very slowly. I started it, only a couple years after the bike. The bike trip was in 2012. Started it in like 14, 15, and then just very slowly wrote it. Wrote about half during COVID. That was a good project, side project to have during COVID when you have a little bit of extra time. But yeah, you get better at it as you go. And it was definitely a journey in itself, just writing the book.
You kept, I guess you kept pretty good notes during the trip itself.
I did, yeah. I had a spiral notebook with me, so I kept, detailed notes on some of the finer details to remember that, and then I kept that in a Ziploc bag, so in case rain seeped through the bags, the pannier bags, it would stay dry, along with a binder that had the whole itinerary printed out, as a backup. I actually made turn-by-turn directions, for all 10,000 miles. Just in case, something happened with my phone or whatever. And this was 2000, the smartphones weren't as good then. I didn't even have an iPhone, actually. I got an iPhone a little later, but I had a Droid Pro. So it was kind of a basic smartphone, but I was able to get Google Maps on it. And, that's all you need, really.
I also appreciate the quote at the beginning from Jedediah Jenkins, who also wrote a compelling bike journey book called To Shake the Sleeping Self, one of my favorite books. And I see similarities between his journey and yours. Both of you made these big pronouncements that you were going to undertake a significant bike journey, and both of you had never done anything like it before.
Yeah, I mean, I loved his book as well, and he said in his book, he talks about speaking it into reality, and sometimes you have to circle a date on the calendar and speak it into reality. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So for us, back when my trip was still a group thing, we had circled February 27, 2012 on the calendar a couple years before that. That's day one. And then we kind of built out the schedule from there. And then, long story short, my college roommates who were going to be on the trip dropped out. And it was just a solo thing. But I think you have to do that. You have to pick a date and start speaking into reality. Start telling people you're going to do it, and then it kind of puts pressure on yourself to fulfill that.
You mentioned your college buddies that were going to join with you, but one by one they began to drop out, and so you now had to consider this as a solo bike trip across America and back. What inspired you to continue?
Yeah, and that totally changed the complexion of it. But I had already committed to it. I didn't get a job senior year of college. Everybody else is interviewing and getting ready for the real world after graduation, and I didn't do that. I was committed to this. I was also doing it to raise money for a charity, which is the Marty Lyons Foundation on Long Island, and they raise money to grant wishes for terminally ill and chronically ill children. And I'm actually on the board of the foundation now. So that, I committed to that and wanted to continue for that reason. But really, I mean, the main thing was that I I wanted to do this. I figured it was a once in a lifetime experience, an opportunity. You're not going to be able to do something like this again. The gap between college and that first real job was ideal for it. And a family friend kind of was the original inspiration, who's my parents' age, he did his bike trip across the US as well, right after college. And so that hearing his stories, his name is Chris Pryor, hearing his stories, that was one of the original, actually the first inspiration for the trip. So but yeah, I once they were out, it was, I never would have, thought of the trip or wanted to do it alone originally, because I just thought that sounds crazy. I want to do it as a group thing. But because the last person to drop out, got hurt snowboarding only 3 weeks before I was going to leave, didn't really give me much time to think about it, which is probably a good thing. If I had more time to think about it, I might have not done it. But once I started, you get used to being alone. And the great thing about traveling alone is that you really are forced to reach out and connect with strangers much more so than you would ever do, if you were with one or two other people. You would tend to kind of stick to your own, and of course you meet people when you travel, but not nearly as much as when you travel alone. And you also become more approachable too. So I started to become more outgoing than I'd ever been in my life. And that really added a lot to the trip. It was hard in the beginning to be alone, but then I really started to thrive on it after a while.
Your book starts off with what I call a bike traveler's oh shit moment when you're crossing the Continental Divide in New Mexico. And
Yeah.
The climb seems endless. You're second guessing yourself. Self-doubt is starting to creep in. And but for the kindness of a couple that you ended up meeting with, you might have been in some pretty serious trouble. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I decided to open the book with this story, which happened in New Mexico, as you said, because it was one of the craziest days and nights of the trip, and it kind of encapsulated a little bit of everything. So the challenges of it, the elements, really struggling, and then the kindness of strangers ultimately. So going over this mountain pass in New Mexico, about 10,000 feet, so pretty high up there. And this is April, so for all intents and purposes, it's winter. At that elevation, there's a lot of snow on the side of the road. It's cold, and I'm not prepared for that. I don't have, I mailed my only pair of sweatpants back to my parents because I wanted to save space in the bags, and they were taking up too much space. So I'm coldest I've ever been in my life. By the time I finally get to the actual top, I'm hitting fall summit after fall summit. When I'm at the actual top of the mountain, the sun's going down. So the whole way down through the switchbacks is in the dark. So first couple of turns I can see okay, and then all of a sudden I come around one turn and it's now pretty much completely dark at this point. And I hear something on the pavement. It's like hooves on the pavement, and in front of me is a herd of elk crossing the road. I'm on literally a collision course to hit this herd of elk. And, I could actually hear them before I could see them because it had become so dark, and there wasn't a moon or anything. It was a new moon, so no light from the moon. But almost ran into him. I was able to hit the brakes in time. But, it was one of the craziest things to ever happen to me. And a huge adrenaline rush. And then, the whole rest of the way down is in total darkness, but the stars were incredible. The most amazing sky I've ever seen. So you had a little bit of everything on that night, and then finally I come into this little town that really didn't have much in it. No stores, no motels or anything. But I saw this elderly Native American couple getting out of their car in their driveway, and I pulled up into their driveway and could barely even speak because I was so cold, and I was sick too. A pretty bad cold. So, but they ended up offering their, a place to stay that night. I went inside, warmed up. They had this big wood-fired stove right off the kitchen, this really old home. And, I sat by the stove for a couple hours and just thawed out. And the woman, Mrs. Ulibarri, made me some eggs and toast for dinner around 10 p.m. or so by the time I finally ate. So it was and I just spoke with them and sipped cups of coffee for a couple hours and told them my story, and they were just happy to help. And then the next morning I showered, took a photo of them in their living room to remember them, and got back on the road. And things like that happened a lot, where no connections to these people, but they were just happy to, they saw I was in shorts and a light windbreaker in the middle of the night and had just come over a mountain. But it was funny because the next morning we're having breakfast before I hit the road, and I think it was their niece came over for breakfast, and we started talking, and she goes, I told her the whole story about going over the mountain and the elk, and then Henry the man is asking me, well, what's your next stop? And I explained I'm going to go to a hotel with a casino the next night and kind of try to get over my cold. And he goes, well, do you like to gamble? And the niece cuts me off before I could answer, and she goes, well, he's already gambled enough. She looks at me seriously, like my mom or something, with narrowed eyes. And she goes, he's already gambled enough with his life, and he won. So I was like, but I'm 24 years old. I'm not really thinking about the risk of it as much, but it is a dangerous thing to do. Even when you don't have herds of elk crossing the road and mountains in New Mexico, it's just the traffic can be dangerous. But that was one of the I thought that little story with the elk kind of encapsulated a little bit of everything that the trip brought. So I thought it was a good way to open the book. And originally the editors that helped me out didn't want to open with that. They wanted to put that in the New Mexico chapter and kind of be more chronological with it. But I liked that story to kind of jump right into it and kind of give the reader a sense of what the trip was about, and then take a step back and go into the backstory of the why and the background, and then start the trip chronologically from there.
It's a perfect start to the book, and you're right, it does encapsulate just about everything that you experienced. So any of us who have considered a long bike trip or a tour or whatever it is, there's some inspiration that you found from others. Yours were Chris Pryor, who's a family friend. He biked across the US and then up and down the Pacific coast. And then Barbara Savage, she and her husband biked across America and then around the world. And I downloaded her audiobook to my Audible account, Miles from Nowhere. Can't wait to listen to it.
It's a great book.
You've also mentioned the running scene from Forrest Gump, which is a great
Yeah.
visual. That is such a great visual. And finally, the third and most compelling motivation came from 9/11. And I think we can all relate to the tremendous impact it had on the country and on each of us individually. 9/11 struck your family particularly hard from the loss of your uncle, Brian McAleese. And I'm sorry for that loss, and may he rest in peace. But you do say that your heroes, your dad, your mom, your uncles. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think 9/11 obviously changed the world. It changed everybody's perspective, and but especially our family. My uncle was a firefighter, as you mentioned, and since that day, I was at a very impressionable age at that time. I was 13 years old, and it just totally changed my perspective on. A few years later, I'm in college, and thinking, wow, my uncle was 36 years old when this happened. As a 13-year-old kid, that seems a lot older, and it is. But then when you approach your 20s, it's all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's really not so far away. So it kind of gave me the way that my uncle lived his life too. He was very, he really sought out. He didn't wait for the good parts, the good parts of life. He really sought them out. He created them, and he was just that personality. So knowing him and knowing the way that he kind of lived life to the fullest, and he truly did that. Not everybody was like that. I thought, well, this is the type of thing that's a once in a lifetime experience, and I want to make sure I do that. And I think it's a millennial thing too, where millennials, my generation, we tend to value experiences over material things. So kind of, maybe delaying on certain adult milestones like buying a house or getting married, and really valuing experiences. And that's what I think this trip was about too, where, even after everybody had dropped out, let's still do it, because you never know, you might not get another chance to do it. And I think 9/11 really proved the uncertainty of the world, and made everybody kind of value each day a little bit more. And I certainly, being 13 years old, it was obviously a very difficult thing to go through. But it also changed my perspective, and in some positive ways too.
Agreed. All right. So you planned this whole trip out using Google Maps. There are much more sophisticated route planning tools available now.
Yeah.
But you managed to make Google Maps work for you, drop pins along the way. I was impressed with how rigid your discipline was to a schedule, because you had a start date and an end date. Many people who undertake epic bike trips like this don't have an end date in mind. They basically have a destination in mind, but you had an end date in mind, and you were going to hold your dad to the meal in Little Italy, which I thought was,
we had a little bet going.
Yeah, so a little bet. So you've got a mindset, and you get down to North Carolina, where you're going to begin the trip. I believe it's North Carolina, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
And
Wilmington.
This was, other than your shakedown ride that you did around your home, this was the first time you'd really ridden fully packed and racked, and you were a little shaky at first.
Yeah. Kind of, I think I write in the book, procrastination at its finest. I didn't actually strap down all of the gear until we're in the pier parking lot in Wilmington, about to hit the road. So, and I was with my good friend Fritz, who drove out, rode out the first few miles with me, who was my Uncle Brian's best friend growing up. So it's good to have someone, and he helped me kind of strap down everything correctly. But I had done, as you mentioned, I'd done a trial run, and I put the panniers on the bike for the first time and threw some sweatshirts and stuff in there just to try to simulate it. But you can't really simulate it until you're truly packed and ready to go. And it was a lot more weight. I ended up having about 80 pounds of gear, which is a lot. So it wasn't traveling. If I did it again, I probably would try to travel a little bit lighter. But yeah, I was really wobbling at first, and then you eventually figure out that you don't actually have to turn too much once you really hit the highway. So in the beginning, there in Wilmington, there was a lot of turning, so I was just trying to navigate the bike, and it was difficult, when you're not used to it, because it was kind of like driving a tractor trailer when you're used to driving a little car. So everything was kind of slow to respond to your movement. So it was, but like anything, it takes a little getting used to, and then I was able to handle it fine. Didn't really have any major mechanical issues with the bike. It was a Trek 520, held up really well. Had flat tires, of course, probably about 25 of them, but no real big issues. So I think that the Trek 520 was a good investment.
Yeah. I ride a similar bike, the Surly long haul trucker.
Yeah, that's another one, right? Yeah.
But your first day was pretty incredible. You managed to log about 90 miles, and I want to understand how you felt. In the book, you say you were elated that you'd had such a monumental day one. And you felt like, I'm good to go now.
Yeah, I was, a lot of nerves before the first day, especially being alone. Even having breakfast that morning, I just could barely even eat because I was so nervous. And then once you hit the road, start putting miles behind you, those nerves definitely settled in. But that first day felt like I was riding for weeks. It felt so long. And I hit a lot of rain that day. But when I finally made it to Myrtle Beach, because I went from Wilmington to Myrtle Beach that day, So crossed in, from North Carolina to South Carolina, and as you said, it was about 90 miles. And so I mean, that was, first of all, a big day one. I had never gone that far. Even in the trial run, it was 60 miles. That was the farthest I had gone by a good margin. But I was psyched because I thought, hey, if I could do 90 miles day one, and I'm here, I got a place to stay tonight, and I made it to Myrtle Beach. Sometimes you just got to make it through that first day, and I was taking pictures of the Myrtle Beach welcome sign and sending it back to my parents. My mom was elated too. I felt like they didn't think I was going to get through even the first day, I think. So and in some ways I felt like I did the whole trip already. It was just getting through that first day. And then there were a lot of hard days early on, the first few weeks, but I think that was a big moral victory, is hitting that first state border on the first day. It was a big lift, seeing that South Carolina welcome sign. It's like, okay, I'm making progress already day one. And I was able to do 90 miles on day one. So that was, and then I had the next day off which I was pretty sore for most of that day, but I think that was a good way to do it. Kind of, make day one a big one, and then take the next day off. But yeah, it was a monumental first day for me, because I had never gone that far or even close to that far, on a bicycle. And anytime you're 100 miles or close to 100 miles, that's a full day of riding, especially when you're carrying gear.
Yeah, it's a good 10 hours in the saddle. It's a long day.
Yeah.
It's not my intent to go through the entire trip. I just want to hit a few of the highlights. But one that stuck out to me was the day you didn't quit, near Quitman, Georgia.
Quitman, Georgia, right? Yeah. It was a really hot day, maybe the hottest day of the whole trip. In the Georgia heat and humidity. I was just had a rough couple of days, and I was just feeling like I'm getting tired of all this already, living out of my panniers day after day. And, I'm just very irritable, sore. I can't seem to really find my groove here. Early days of the trip. And I come across this little town in I think it's, southern Georgia, and it's called Quitman. And I'm just took a break, and I'm, eating a Cliff Bar and drinking my basically boiling water out of my water bottles, probably hot enough to make tea with that water. And I'm just thinking, this is going to be a long, long trip, man. And, I'm looking at the sign, and it says "Quit Man," and I read it as, "Quit period man." And, and then I thought about it, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to keep going. And I still think about that day a lot, because it would have been easy to quit at that point. I made it pretty far on my own. Again, didn't expect this to be on my own. But if there was a point in the trip that I was really thinking about quitting, it was at that point. And the sign just kind of spoke to me, hey, it's quit, man. But I didn't quit, and it got better from there. I was happy to continue it. But yeah, those hard days, those early days were pretty difficult, but I still think about that day sometimes. Anytime I, think about quitting something, well, there's precedent for this.
When did you start to feel like you were hitting some kind of groove? Like, your pedaling cadence was good, and you were used to the weight on the bike, and, things seemed to be going, dramatically better.
Yeah. Later than you would think. I didn't really think that I started to feel like I was in a groove and hitting my stride until Utah. So that was pretty far into the trip. Probably hit Utah in like April. So a couple months in, almost. And that's, I started feeling better on the bike, as you said, with the cadence and kind of the pace. And there was one day where I crossed from, I guess it was Colorado into Utah. And I was a day behind at that point, but I actually made up some ground, and I got to Moab, Utah on time to get back on schedule. Because, you were talking about the schedule before. The schedule was everything. That was kind of like my Bible for actually pulling this thing off. If I was on schedule, I was happy. If I was a day behind, I was doing everything I could to get back on schedule. But this day I went, it was the longest day of the trip in miles. It was about 120 miles, which was, a sunrise to sunset ride, Colorado to Utah. So it was a big day. And I really felt good getting into Moab that night. And at that point, I felt like I was in really good cycling shape. But it took longer than I thought. I thought I'd be feeling good a few states before that at least, but I would say it took until Utah.
Right, you make it to the coast, and you've been sprinkling in some rest days, and you're keeping up with your schedule pretty well. In fact, I think you a couple of times you might have even gotten ahead of your schedule, and you had a little extra time. So you're on the coast, and now you're going to head north up the coast to begin the journey back across the United States through some pretty desolate areas. But you rode up to Oregon, I think just south of Portland, and that's probably the Coast Highway. I think you were probably utilizing at that point. Probably some of the best scenery we have to offer is once you get a little bit north of San Francisco, you begin to really appreciate the west coast of California, and then Oregon and Washington. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Pacific Coast Highway. One of my favorite places in the world for sure. And I had driven it as not me driving, but as a kid with my family when we lived out there in California for a year. We had done the PCH drive from San Francisco to LA, so the kind of the southern part of it. And I had been up to the Redwoods with my family too, so I knew about it. But biking it was a totally different experience. And you just go through Redwoods, which was incredible. And then the road goes out, and you're on these cliffs, and then you're back into the Redwoods. So it's really one of the most amazing places I think on the planet. And the only place that redwoods are even around anymore. They used to cover a big part of the planet, but now they're really only in Northern California and Southern Oregon, and I think parts maybe of Washington too. So really the Pacific Northwest. So it was just an incredible, and I talk a lot about the redwoods and how you're just kind of in this different space when you bike through the redwoods, and especially there's this one road called the Avenue of the Giants, where you get off the highway and it's not busy at all, and it's just you and the road and the trees, and it's pretty, it's kind of like a magical thing to go through. And I had some winds to deal with when you're on the actual coast, away from the trees, mostly north to south wind. So I was going north, but I was against the wind for, so that made it a little bit challenging. And there are some hillier parts too, hillier than you'd think. But yeah, I would love to do that ride again. Just the PCH, it was just incredible.
And on a bicycle, 10 miles an hour, 11 miles an hour, you're taking it in a much better fashion. You're really getting a sense of the magnificence of those redwoods and the scenery and just the landscape itself. So you make a right turn in Oregon, and you start heading east back to your home in New York. I was particularly struck by the section where you rode across South Dakota. But before that, you had a lot of nice things to say about Idaho. I believe your route took you through southern Idaho, or were you a little further north?
Yeah, it was southern Idaho. Yeah, I didn't go through Boise, but I went kind of near it, around it, and then up through like the Sawtooths and down into like Sun Valley, that area.
Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, beautiful state. I think Idaho is a very underrated state. Yeah, at least I hadn't really heard much about it. But it was probably my favorite state, just because it was a lot of untouched, nature and scenery, and the mountains there were incredible. And I stayed with this great family too, and they lived in a log cabin in Sun Valley, and they were. I stayed a couple days with them. I actually stayed a little more time than was on the schedule. So it just surprised me, I guess, Idaho. I knew California was beautiful, and at the PCH, I knew that was going to be a great part of the ride. And So way more cyclists on that stretch than anywhere else for good reason. But Idaho kind of caught me by surprise. So I think that was one of the best parts of the trip for sure. And I was there for the 4th of July too. And it was kind of this very, I was in Stanley up in the mountains, and very old school feeling 4th of July festivities. It felt like you were kind of back in time. So that was cool too.
So I recall a story about a solo female traveler who was doing the Baja Divide, and she was running low on water, and she was really in a pickle. She wasn't sure exactly what to do, and a pickup truck pulled up next to her, and they had tons of ice cold water in the back of the pickup. So she was saved at that moment. She learned that they were actually a support group for the Baja 1000, which is a off-road race. And they were schlepping water from town to town along the routes in support of the drivers. So she was very lucky. Similarly, you're in South Dakota going through the Badlands, and there is nothing there, as you were told. In one of your last stops,
I was
nothing
warned.
there for miles and miles and miles.
Yep.
And you had 5 bottles of water, but that may or may not have been enough. But some trail angels came to your rescue.
Yep. And it was definitely the day I needed this most, because when you run out of water, I mean, it's surprising how quickly you feel the effects of that. The first thing that'll happen is you get a really bad headache. And you start to, as you dehydrate, your muscles start to cramp up, and so that there's a whole, you can't go, water's like fuel for a cyclist, right? You're not gonna be able to go very far without water. So I was having breakfast in this diner, the Blue Line Diner in this very small South Dakota town, before I get on Route 212, which is going to take me across the whole state. Very barren road. I knew about it because of Barbara Savage's book, Miles from Nowhere. She describes this road. She actually dedicates a whole chapter, and she only has 15 or so chapters in the whole book, and she goes around the world. So a whole chapter is dedicated to Route 212. So I said, I want to kind of check this out for myself and see it and see the desolation, because being from Long Island, New York, it was kind of unique, very unique for me to see open stretches like that, and so I was pretty curious about it. But when I was having breakfast that morning, the owner of the diner was very concerned that I was going to run out of water, and no food, no water, nothing out there. So I drank as much water as I could handle at breakfast, and filled up my bottles as much as I could, and then hit the road. But I was having really bad headwind, so I was working even harder than I thought I would have to, and drinking more water as a result. So I'm about halfway through the day, and all of a sudden this motorcyclist pulls up in front of me and kind of pulls over the shoulder in front of me, and she hops off her Harley and goes to the back compartment of her bike and takes out this big ice cold water bottle and just hands it to me, and I'm shocked. I'm just looking at her, just not even know what to say. And she said, "This is from Connie, who's the owner of the diner, and the crew at the Blue Line Diner. This is from them." And they also packed me, the Blue Line Diner packed me a bag lunch free of charge and bought my breakfast. So they were incredibly generous. But now they're, getting help from these motorcyclists, to kind of find me and give me the water on the road. So, and then a little later, it didn't stop there. A little later, another motorcyclist going in the other direction stopped, and he hopped off his bike and got an even bigger bottle of water, bigger, colder bottle of water, and handed it to me again. And he said, "This is from the first motorcyclist that was going the other direction." So he must have ran into her at a gas station or something way down the road. So the day I needed it most, I had, this kindness from perfect strangers, that had no connection to me whatsoever. They were just other travelers on the road, and they were looking out for me, as I guess as a fellow biker or just a fellow person, right? Harley or not. So very, very nice to get that help on literally the day I needed it most.
It's a great story. So you cross into Minnesota, and at what point did you feel like, okay, I'm kind of feeling like I I'm going to pull this off. I've got some momentum going. Was that Minnesota or Ohio or?
I think as soon as I made that turn that you mentioned in Oregon, made that right turn, now all of a sudden it's a different mindset because every mile that I put behind me is a mile closer to home for the first time. Up until that point, every mile I was a mile farther from home.
Yes.
So now I'm getting closer and closer. So I think at that point, I was pretty seasoned by that point, having gone, over half the distance at that point, probably over 5,000 or 6,000 miles. And so I think it was a little earlier than Minnesota. But Minnesota is where, I was kind of starting to come out of the Badlands at that point because South Dakota was really the most desolate area. Wyoming too.
Mhm.
Those two states were extremely, extremely desolate. And then when you get into Minnesota, you start to see more towns, more trees. So it started to become a little bit more familiar as you get back farther east.
You make it to New York, and
Yeah.
You get on your bike one last time and ride it to the restaurant. I think it was called Mellows.
La Mela. It means
Mela.
apple. It means apple in Italian. And there's a big red apple on the sign out there. So it's been around for a long time. It's like a very traditional family style restaurant. I always recommend it to people, out of town visiting New York because it's a good old school New York Italian restaurant. Not very expensive, but it's all family style. It's great with big groups, So that's where it was always my favorite. So that's why I want to do we're going to do a group thing for the finish line. That's where I want to do it.
And just like that, your trip is over.
Yeah. It was kind of surreal at the end because, as I was stretching that day, I always, I called it the 5-mile water and stretch break. So it was 5-mile water stretch. I would warm up 5 miles, take a water break, and then stretch on the side of the road. So as I'm doing that for the last time, it kind of hit me that, hey, this is the last day, and all of a sudden this trip's coming to a rapid close. And I kind of didn't want it to end at that point. It was a little sad in a lot of ways because I had grown so accustomed to seeing new places every day, always being on the move, always meeting new people every day, and there are a lot of great things about that. So I knew I was going to miss that, and it was going to be hard to kind of lock down and stay in one place. And it all kind of hit me on the last time I was stretching on the side of the road. But at the same time, it was a surreal day just to bike back into New York City again, and I felt like a tourist looking up at the buildings, and right through Times Square, and it was all pretty amazing to bike through Manhattan. And then end, at Little Italy on Mulberry Street at La Mela, and have all, a big crowd of people in the street, family, friends, and that was all pretty surreal. It didn't feel real, and then I didn't expect there to be a real finish line either, but there was. Right before I got there, all of a sudden I see this silver streaming thing go across the street, and it was my two uncles holding it, Uncle Kevin and Uncle John. And I crossed the finish line, and then just started immediately hugging everyone around me, and it was pretty special ending. Even better than I had envisioned it when it was a group trip. So,
well, it's an amazing story, and again, a really well written book. It's more than just a book about a trip across America and back on a bicycle. You had a lot of time to think about things, think about life, think about what you plan to do or may not have planned to do after you finish the trip. But it's an amazing story. And in the days and weeks after you finished the trip, kind of what was that like as you began to settle back into a former routine?
Yeah, well, I remember a couple of days after, so we had the big party at La Mela, and then the next day I didn't do too much, but then the day after I got back on the bike again. I said, I'm that had become the way that I started my day, and that was my workout. That was my so it had just become so routine to me. So I just went 9 miles. I did the old 9-mile workout I used to do in high school and college. My dad had done it, just a loop around our town, and because I just didn't know what else to do yet, I guess, but it's not the same, obviously, and doing a loop that I had done so many times before just wasn't as fun. So I really put the bike away after that. Maybe you went out a couple more times, but in the 15 years since the trip, in the 11 years since the trip, I haven't done really any biking at all. So I kind of retired it, but yeah, I mean, it was kind of weird getting back into normal life a little bit. But in some ways, looking back on it, that seems like a dream. Just that departure, that 7-month departure from normal life was just so different and so much longer. It felt like so much longer than 7 months. And I think because there were so many memories every day and so many new things that kind of slowed down time in a lot of ways. Because 7 months now, it flies by. You're in a routine, you're in a groove, working, and 7 months ago today was January, right? That doesn't seem so long ago. But on the trip, that 7 months felt like a couple of years at least. So.
Yeah, you packed a lot into each and every day. So the podcast is really aimed to inspire others to take up bike travel. And I don't think we're promoting a crisscross across the United States as much as we are saying, you can go places on a bike. It's very doable. And you don't have to go great distances. You can go short distances, or you can go great distances. But you'd be amazed at how free you become riding a bike on a trip.
Absolutely. And that was one of the goals for the book too, to inspire not just travel, but I think action in general. Do that thing you always want to do but pushed off. But yeah, I agree about bike travel. And even if you just do an overnight where you camp out one night for a weekend or something, or even just a day trip, and go somewhere you've never been, even it doesn't have to be far from home. You're going to see that route and those places along it in a totally different light, even if you've driven that route before. Like I said, with the PCH, driving it and then biking it, two very different things. And, you're just part of it, and you feel like you're on an adventure, and it's a great way to travel. It's a great way to, get a great workout in, but also just see things in a different light. And so you don't have to go far from home, I don't think. Yeah, if you can spend a couple nights overnight, and whether you're staying in a motel or camping out, that adds a lot to it too, because you'll experience those little towns that don't maybe they don't get many out of towners, right? Maybe because you can only travel so far on a bike in a day. So I was going across the country. I was staying in these little towns that aren't tourist spots, because even if someone's driving cross country, they're just going to blow right through them. So you'll see a lot more when you're on a bike, because you have to. You're going so much slower than you would in a car. You're not breezing by all these things. So great way to travel, and you have to just do it to know what we're talking about, right? If you've never done it before, you have to give it a shot, and you'll see exactly what we mean.
John Nitti, author of the book Sharing the Road, an Amateur Cyclist 10,000-mile solo bike trip across America. John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today and reliving the book in person. It's an amazing story. I recommend everyone get a copy and read it. It is inspirational and a fun read. There are humorous moments, and there are some not so humorous moments, but it's a tremendous story. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Brian. This has been fun. A lot of fun.